Welcome to Challenging Narratives and Practices, part of the podcast series about the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, a professional network of grant-making practitioners, referred to as AGAG. This podcast series is part of the AGAG Legacy Project that documents its contributions to philanthropy. In this episode, we hear excerpts from interviews with practitioners who have been part of the network. They reflect on how discussions about power dynamics and practices influence them. And most importantly, we learn how AGAG challenged practitioners to understand how narratives about Africa shape their approach to grant-making practices.
How people experienced their involvement with the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group and how it changed them. That's its legacy.
The philanthropic organizations who make grants play an important role in supporting organizations working to help their communities address problems and improve lives. Philanthropy support organizations such as affinity groups or funder networks provide a platform where funders with similar interests come together as a learning community. AGAG, formed in 2000, was unique as the only funder network in the U.S. focusing on Africa. AGAG organized regular meetings, conducted and curated groundbreaking research, and served as a bridge connecting new and experienced funders with diverse interests. AGAG was a distinctive space where practitioners explored tensions in the relationships between each other and narratives about Africa and Africans. During its first 5 years, AGAG formalized membership, developed its mission to promote increased and more effective funding in Africa, and held an annual meeting that became its signature event. The network rapidly grew into a diverse group of grant-making practitioners from organizations of various sizes, approaches, and interests. As Chris Allen reflects, AGAG began to take shape and develop an approach and point of view.
I'm Chris Allen. I was the Director of Programs at the Global Green Grants Fund from 2000 to 2008. I'm now Executive Director of Ajabu Advisors, working globally on evaluation and strategic plan. If I think back to the first couple years and watching people basically be kind of evangelists back then, well, I'm not saying for good Africa grant making. With some people, it was just for Africa grant making at all. But, can we keep in mind where Africa fits within this philanthropy landscape, saying, no, we have a role here. We're all doing good things. We do different things. But at that point, just bringing people into the tent itself was enough, I think, at that time. And I watched them, and I tried to participate and do my bit as well.
AGAG's formation was timely, and a significant development seeking to influence how American foundations engaged with Africa. And as Tade Aina reflects, this was timely and significant.
Tade Akin Aina. I started off with the Ford Foundation, where I served for 10 years, which is where I first encountered and engaged AGAG. I left the Ford Foundation to go to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, left Carnegie Corporation to help establish Partnership for African Social and Governance Research, and retired from that position, and I joined the MasterCard Foundation as the head of research. I think AGAG was significantly important when it started as a space for private U.S.-based foundations working with Africa at that specific time, where it was the beginning of a way of changing the narratives around relationships, exploring the narratives around the power relations, around relations of solidarity, both between the U.S. foundations themselves and, of course, within the U.S. foundations, and then between U.S. foundations and Africans. And it's important because it's been the evolution of a very significant process and space for working together.
As the network evolved, it faced several challenges. Raoul Davion reflects on one of them.
Raoul Davion, when I was a member of AGAG and for a period of time on the steering committee, I served as the Associate Director for Education at the MacArthur Foundation, and today I am the Director of Strategy and Learning at the Malala Fund, where I've been for 6+ years working on girls' education issues. I think the top challenge, which was part of the DNA of the Africa Grant Makers, was the geography versus sector orientation. in such a large geography to begin with. And so you had to create interest groups and spaces within that. I was able to use the African grant makers and the network that it afforded me to take forward some of those other more sector-specific conversations, but within the umbrella of the pieces of that work, parts of that work that were focused in countries in Africa. But I think that was a challenge. And then we talked many times about how to sort of create an opening space for new members, while also, again, wanting to go deeper on some of the larger philanthropic trends on the continent.
And there were other challenges in building the network, as Niamani Mutima explains.
My name is Niamani Mutima, and I've served as the executive director of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group since 2001. So AGAG did have the reputation of being a club for program officers from the larger foundations, because the larger foundations were the ones who were really at the core of starting the network. But I was very aware of that diversity within the group and how it often fueled tensions and different power dynamics. You know, given who and how it started, it was easy to see how that was the impression. But what I tried to do was to engender a sense of equity, of openness.
AGAG's diversity was in contrast to the silo funding approach that characterizes American philanthropy. The tension around grant-making budgets and sizes often prevented colleagues who made smaller grants and those who made larger grants from getting to know each other or finding a connection between their work. Jennifer Astone recalls how being a part of the network provided a different experience for her.
My name is Jennifer Astone. I am currently principal at Integrated Capital Investing. And when I was with the AGAG network, I was the executive director at the Firelight Foundation. Of course, there are multiple power dynamics operating all the time. The size of money is really huge. I remember being in the room with the Ford Foundation and Carnegie Corporation. They make $100,000, $200,000 grants and working with large institutions. And frankly, for myself, who worked with the Global Fund for Women and Firelight that made smaller grants, it was a little intimidating. And when they walk into a room, they're expecting a level of, we're going to make social change happen. And so I think there's a notion that with bigger dollars, you can have this bigger impact in terms of government policy or changing whether the situation, right, for the better. And I think a couple things nuanced that. One is we got to know each other as people, and that enabled us to have conversations that I never otherwise would have had. Normally, I would have had no reason to connect with them because they weren't specifically working on HIV and AIDS or with children. However, because we were in these conversations together, they learned about the work that we were doing at Firelight, and I learned about their work and gained an appreciation for it. And it reminded me that we're all part of an ecosystem and that we need to recognize that there are different ways of doing this work.
As Yvonne Moore shares, she views the range of interests and approaches represented in the AGAG network as a challenge for the philanthropy sector, and one that AGAG has demonstrated can be managed.
My name is Yvonne Moore. I am the former executive director of the Daphne Foundation. I am the founder and managing director at Moore Philanthropy, and I am the president and CEO of Moore Impact. I think it's a challenge, not for AGAG, but for us as the community coming together. I think AGAG has actually managed it quite well. And a perfect example is that folks who come from larger institutions or foundations could easily dominate a conversation. The best ideas come out of a space in which we're actually trying to seek change. And that can be how challenges are actually broken apart and named and then tackled. So I think the challenge has not been AGAG's. I think the challenge has been ours as a sector. And I actually appreciate AGAG establishing, I guess, the ground rules, for a lack of a better phrase, in that we begin every conference with a reminder, we are here to do this work better. We are not here to compare or differentiate between how our largesse came about. We're here to do good work. And this is the space. You may choose to remain. But this is how we operate. These are the norms. These are the values by which we live. And I actually appreciate it. And it also frees up the conversation. It's like if you're uncomfortable or you don't want to be in a space in which someone else came about their money because they chose to engage community in raising those funds, I'm not sure this is the space for you. And it's just like, get the drama out the way. Everybody's there to try to do good work. So yeah, so it's going to be a challenge because that's the way the sector is crafted. But AGAG has made it where it doesn't have to be.
Other challenges for AGAG were remaining relevant and managing the expectations of grant-making practitioners. Experienced grantmakers look to the network for a perspective on how their grant-making fit within the broader funding landscape and how their approach aligned or differed from others. Those new to the field wanted to meet and learn from more seasoned colleagues and those funding in other areas. AGAG's annual conferences and other programs were designed for the mix of new and experienced practitioners. They examined specific topics and cross-cutting issues that were relevant to current shifts in the philanthropy sector and in Africa. It was a balancing act that for Nicolette Naylor, AGAG navigated successfully.
Nicolette Naylor, I'm the International Director for Gender, Racial and Ethnic Justice at the Ford Foundation. I've been involved in AGAG as a member when I was a program officer, and I've been involved in the advisory committee as well. I think that having such a diverse ecosystem helped you to see that no one foundation can do everything and that different approaches can work. Because often you were taught, if you were new to philanthropy, you were taught the ways of your institution and not some other way. And so learning about other ways, learning about the work that those that were working at a more local level, those that were working, doing smaller, more rapid response work, those that were working on different thematic areas, different countries. I think that was a strength, that diversity, in terms of rather than having everyone with the same strategy working on the same issue. I've been in networks where it's like all the women's rights funders together. And there's value in everyone having the same vision and the same perspective on an issue. But you also miss out versus the much more broader networks. This was a network that was geography. It was based on the geography. It wasn't on education or on a particular theme. And I think that was the value in that was so much engagement is on the continent and on Africa, because it opened up our eyes to the breadth and the scope of what was possible on the continent and how one could collaborate and leave space for others to take on something. And you expanded your own network to say, we don't do this, but so does this. So be telling people, we can't fund this, but others can. And again, for your own learning trajectory, that was useful. But I do think the challenge of that is when you have such diverse views and people want to come to a meeting or be part of a network to learn more about their issue or their thing. And then AGAG can't be everything to everyone, because now you're such a diverse group and everyone wants you to be focusing on their particular issue. And I know over time, the debates around focus, broadness, all of those kinds of debates. And I think the leadership and your leadership also navigated those tensions quite well that did arise in such a diverse space and being pulled in different directions.
But for staff working in some roles, the diversity was perhaps not as useful. Chris Allen comments.
If we were talking about, say, kind of grant-making strategy to complex social situations, there I think the diversity did not help a lot, because a lot of people who found themselves in very technical roles in fairly traditional foundations, they just, whether they agreed with discussion or not, there wasn't a lot they could do about it, you know? But on the other sense, like, say, for getting a perspective of what people are doing across the continent, and so seeing that whole spectrum among them was really terrific. And then as more and more Africans started coming in from the continent, obviously everything they had to say had a huge weight. And the more Africans that came in over the years, I think the diversity wasn't just other viewpoints, but really other really valuable viewpoints.
The network included practitioners based in different countries, including those working for American foundations with offices in Africa. Mamo Mohapi, based in South Africa, shares how initially she was unsure if AGAG's diversity would be helpful. But when her foundation began to fund in different areas and countries, and her role changed, the colleagues she met made the transition easier.
So my name is Mamotshidisi Mohapi, and I work for the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. My experience has been that the diversity has actually been one of the strengths of the network, in that if I think about my own kind of journey in philanthropy as an example, when I came into the space, my role was very focused, narrowed to work that's happening in South Africa. And so that's all that I was interested in at that point. When I got into the space in AGAG, I got exposed to what's happening outside of South Africa. I got exposed to what others are doing, how they're approaching it, understanding where everybody is in their journey on philanthropy in the continent. It may not have been beneficial to me at the time based on my role, but for example, my scope of work has since increased to work outside of the continent. And because of some of the linkages and the connections and the exposure to other work in other countries that I had during my time at AGAG, when I now had to venture out into other countries, I either had contacts, I knew so-and-so is funding in a particular country, let me reach out and hear what they think about this particular issue or that or some or the other. So I think for me, the diversity is beneficial in that respect. I have found that at times when I was fairly new in the space, it got overwhelming for me getting into a space where you had some that were very experienced and knowledgeable about these issues, and you're just coming in and you have no clue what any of these things are. But for me, I see it as part of really creating a space for growth for people that come into the space. The fact that there are such varied groups of people from different contexts, different worldviews, and it just can only enrich the discussions that you have as well in the space, which for me has been the most refreshing thing about AGAG. The fact that the conversations, they really go deep. They force you to really interrogate your own practices, how you see philanthropy, and it can only be because you have such a rich group of experiences, whether it be new, old, or different. So for me, I see it as a good thing. But it just depends on where you sit and what you want out of the space. Yeah.
As the only funder network in the U.S. focusing on Africa, AGAG's annual meeting gained popularity. It was a rare meeting place where practitioners from funding organizations based in Africa, Europe, and North America met regularly and formed professional relationships and friendships. For many new hires, the AGAG meeting was part of their orientation process. The discussions focused less on the transactional aspects of grant-making and more on understanding context, building relationships, and questioning assumptions. AGAG's research agenda was shaped by the issues that emerged from the discussions, as Niamani Mutima explains.
So there really wasn't much information available to the public about trends in private funding targeting Africa. So AGAG began to explore the questions that emerged from the conversations, and we did research projects to fill in the gap. And in 2007, we looked at funding for health and basic education for children in countries in Southern Africa. And we not only examined the amount of money, but we also looked at who was receiving it. And a key finding from that research project was that the majority of the grants were going to organizations that were headquartered in Africa, but the majority of the money was going to intermediary organizations and organizations that were headquartered outside of Africa. And one of the alarming facts was that on average, international organizations were receiving 900% more funding than their national counterparts in African countries. So we did a follow-up research project to explore why funders would choose one method or the other, why they would choose to fund directly or through an intermediary. And that project also looked at whether or not how an organization receives money affects the impact. Whether or not if they receive a grant directly or they receive funding through an intermediary organization, what was the impact on them being able to improve their organization, to strengthen it, to use the resources where they were needed so that they could continue to do the work.
Those findings, published in the 2011 report, Making the Right Fit, found that how national NGOs in Africa received support did make a difference. Funders, intermediary organizations, and national NGOs all play a part in the funding partnerships, but each is working at a distance and within a local context. The interplay of these core issues influence practitioners and shape grant-making practices. And as Karen Colvard recalls, the group did not shy away from talking about money and power.
My name is Karen Colvard. I was the program director at the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation during the time I was involved with AGAG. The perennial discussion about who has control of things. Is it the people with the money, or is it the people with the ideas? Is it the people on the ground, or is it the people who work in New York and Washington and San Francisco? We were always talking about that, and I think in general, people always said that they were on the side of more local control and less power to the people with money. But I don't necessarily think that it has changed that much over the many years. I think things have gotten better in that regard, but it was something that AGAG talks about all the time, and I think very usefully.
Raoul Davion reflects on how early on, AGAG acknowledged that there were issues of power and representation that needed to be addressed.
One of the things that occurred to me was just all the discussions that we had around shifting power, around the balance of funders from the global north versus those who were based on the continent. And those were certainly early conversations of many that have more come to fruition now within the philanthropic space. So I think it was extremely relevant at the time to starting to grapple with those still difficult issues of power and representation within philanthropy. I don't think we used back then the same words for them we would now, but it definitely was the earlier part of the conversation that philanthropy is having explicitly today. So I think that was an extremely valuable function that the Africa Grant Makers Affinity Group played, more so than any other network that I was a part of.
Many have called for a paradigm shift in the philanthropy sector to help address questions of representation and power. During AGAG's annual conferences and other meetings, discussions about grant-making practices emphasize the need to understand context, especially when working in communities and cultures outside of your own. Akwasi Aidoo reflects on the call for a paradigm shift and his experience working in the philanthropy sector.
Akwasi Aidoo is my name. When I joined AGAG at the beginning, I was at the Ford Foundation as Director of Special Initiative for Africa, which later on became Trust Africa. Overall, I've been in the field of philanthropy since 1988. And after Trust Africa, moved on to Humanity United as Senior Fellow, providing guidance for their work in Africa. Person who came up with the concept said paradigm shift when the old people die, when there's a new generation and they come with a completely different mindset. But we don't have to wait till the major global foundations die for that shift to happen. So the second way is to have platforms where ideas can be exchanged and people can listen and learn from each other and so on. And the third way is really, it's almost like walking the talk. Because if you look at the values of major foundations, the values are excellent. But the work is often not according to the talk. And so it has to do with diversity, inclusion, and justice. Diversity is on the upswing. in terms of staff. When I joined the Ford Foundation, for example, I was the only African regional director. And we had offices in Harare, in Nairobi, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Namibia, in Sudan, in Egypt, in Senegal, in Nigeria. But I was the only one. And it's changed completely. And that's one way of bringing culture to it, to the center of it, in terms of having a diverse staff within the continent, people who really understand the context and the texture of the environment.
The intimate setting and size of AGAG's annual meetings, coupled with its process, values, and point of view, helped to shape its uniqueness. AGAG's focus was the people who were a part of it, and who helped to shape its evolution. It created a welcoming and supportive space where practitioners examined how they could influence change. Questioning assumptions that guide how the philanthropy sector operates and resources are distributed, and challenging the narratives about Africa and Africans that shaped grant-making strategy were at the core of its approach. Nicolette Naylor recalls how the discussions raised questions and promoted a community-centered approach to philanthropy before it became a popular topic of conversation.
AGAG was talking about communities at the center before it became hip and woke to talk about communities at the center, and the white savior mentality in terms of philanthropy, how to engage with Africa in a way that's not patronizing. Those are conversations that are live right now, and everyone's talking about it. And if you're new to philanthropy, understanding the power dynamic between the US and Africa, it's there. But it wasn't like that when I started in philanthropy. And so I feel like AGAG was talking about those things, the political issues at the time when it wasn't being spoken about in networks, and it wasn't being spoken about within a US context for people that were working in Africa, that were traveling to the US or working in foundations that had a US headquarters. You weren't getting that kind of content or that kind of a conversation around power or around how to engage as a US foundation in Africa. But AGAG was actually talking about that.
Philanthropy has its share of donors who are interested in giving resources, but hold negative stereotypes about the people they seek to help. AGAG was a place where practitioners could talk about the attitudes they encountered. Jennifer Astone reflects on the issues that need to be addressed in philanthropy and her experience.
Another big one is around race, obviously, and who are the people that are in the funding positions. I just think that what was really supportive about AGAG is that it was a place where we were able to talk about those dynamics and the politics of philanthropy and the positioning around the work that we were doing. And how does that play out in reality when you have a staff in the United States and you're training people? AGAG was a place where those ideas were supported. And I think that's just super important that the people that were working at the other foundations were really grounded and understood African history and the experience of colonialism and exploitation. We at Firelight dealt with a lot of donors who were very naive do-gooders. And it was a very, very difficult and frustrating. And we had a lot of, I'll be honest, racist donors, very uninformed folks about the continent. And AGAG was a place where I could go, where I could talk to other peers who really, that was not the starting place of the conversation.
At the same time that AGAG was building a network of grant-making practitioners, the African philanthropy sector on the continent was also growing. In 2000, the same year AGAG was formed, the African Women's Development Fund, or AWDF, was established in Ghana. When AGAG formalized membership in 2002, AWDF was the first African member. AWDF's significance could not be overstated. It was the first Africa-wide grant-making foundation supporting African women's organizations. Its establishment challenged negative attitudes about the capacity of African-led organizations and the idea that American foundations were the standard bearers. Sarah Mukasa, who worked with AWDF at the time, reflects on how she found AGAG to be an important platform, and one that took a stance in opposition to these narratives.
I joined AWDF in 2006. Now, there were a number of things, as you know, at the time. One, that a fund such as the African Women's Development Fund, which was the first African-led and run fund on the continent, existed. The struggle to develop that fund, it was a completely new model. And at the time, the notions were, can Africans be trusted with these resources? Do Africans have the capacity to lead and run a fund? Can we make these in African institutions? The model was North gives to the South and gives to the South for certain things. So for AWDF, very much at the time, it was an issue around how do we make the case, right? That African institutions can be trusted, know what they're doing, and can be. I mean, it seems silly to talk about it now, but really those were some of the underlying sort of current politically that were running. The second thing was really challenging the traditional notion and the fact that it was felt that Africa had no place in philanthropy except as the recipient of philanthropy, usually from the North to the South. So looking back on it now, we would look at it as very sort of colonial and, in a way, racist notion about philanthropy and philanthropic practice. Now, in joining AGAG, I think AWDF found kindred spirit, right? And I think that was partly because of who was leading AGAG, yourself, Amani, at the time, who could relate on the sort of intersections of sort of race and power and how those impacted on where the dollars were going, on what kinds of philanthropies were being recognized, and this whole sort of discourse around philanthropy. So there was a solidarity there that AWDF and other institutions could rely on in terms of challenging those narratives. Deeply, deeply political work. Deeply, deeply political work.
For Niamani, challenging narratives was a foundation of her approach to managing the network, an approach that was heavily influenced by her personal experiences. And as many have commented, her influence was evident and helped to shape its reputation as a welcoming space where intellectual honesty and learning were valued.
So my approach to my role with AGAG was very intentional because more often than not, discussions about Africa, they're from a deficit perspective. And I didn't and don't view Africa and African communities as undeveloped, needing to be taught how to manage themselves, and agree with the notion that somehow people from the outside have the ability to empower them. I mean, it was odd to think you could ignore the historical context, the colonial legacies, and the redirecting of resources to Europe, the cultural richness and social structures. But for the most part, these are ignored when talking about grant making in Africa. So I don't operate with the default assumption that organizations in Africa do not have capacity. And that bothered me when I first started working with AGAG, and it still continues to bother me in terms of the overall perception of the continent and African people. But it's the starting point for a lot of philanthropy targeting Africa. And I mean, the other dynamic is that as an African American living in America, I encounter the same attitudes. I mean, anytime you talk about African Americans, the default is that we need training. We are not called underdeveloped, but we're called disadvantaged. And just the assumption is that you have a deficit, right? And you need help to manage your communities and to be empowered while operating within the legacies of slavery and the framework of racism. And so in my role with AGAG, I tried to create a space where people felt welcomed and respected, and there was a sense of equity. and also intellectual honesty. You know, the tensions and the power dynamics that emerged within the group, they were all symptomatic of the narratives that people had and have, and how those narratives shape their approaches and strategies. And when a perspective is deeply ingrained, you have to find ways for people to self-reflect, and there's a vulnerability in that process. So you have to create a space where people feel safe. And because it's a collective process, it's a community conversation, it's okay for people to influence each other and to be influenced by other people as well. And hopefully to influence their grant-making practices and by extension, the grant-making practices of their organizations. And so the issues of narratives, I think, is central. And I think it's important to challenge the assumptions people have, especially when those assumptions can influence how much and where funding is being directed.
AGAG's research projects over the years explored the issues that were raised during the discussions, and their findings helped to fill gaps in information about trends in funding targeting Africa. The research explored both money and attitudes. In 2015, AGAG commissioned the first ever examination of U.S. Foundation funding for Africa that revealed the majority of funding went to organizations headquartered outside of the continent. Unfortunately, a trend that still continues. In 2021, AGAG published a report about the paths that practitioners have taken to work in the philanthropy sector and the challenges of navigating their roles and relationships. Over the years, AGAG has used its research findings as important reference points to help examine assumptions and explore narratives about funding trends and practices. And as noted philanthropy research expert Stephen Lawrence comments, this approach has been one of its strengths.
Stephen Lawrence. I'm an independent consultant focusing on research on philanthropy. When I first worked with AGAG, I was director of research for Foundation Center, which is now known as Candid. So I think one of the strengths of AGAG has been to not only conduct the research, but to make sure that it doesn't sit on a shelf and to find ways to consistently share that information at convenings, through webinars, through other resources, so that this is constantly being reinforced. One of the most influential studies that came out in recent years was the Hewlett-funded study, which showed that funders learn from their peers. So the reality is, with any research that's being conducted by philanthropy-serving organizations, academic institutions, others, it's really, to what extent does it get into the thinking of funders who then share that knowledge with other funders? That's really how change is going to happen in the philanthropic sector.
Practitioners like Dan Robbins gained valuable insights and lessons that influenced their approach and practice. Part of those discussions included what it means to fail, an important topic that most funders shy away from discussing.
Daniel Robbins, and I'm the executive director and chairman for the Kapnick Trust USA, and I'm the ex officio board member for JF Kapnick Zimbabwe. It's really those little vignettes of discussions that end up being so powerful. There's two different things. One is conceptually the discussion of, hey, what is effective philanthropy and what frames that? And coming away with obvious things like one shoe doesn't fit all feet. So just the idea that you really need to look at each setting and each environment. And also that big philanthropy isn't necessarily good philanthropy. On this disengaging amount of money of a grant or an activity to impact. And then the final one was the idea that as you come in as an external entity to an environment, we have our frame of reference. And even when we try and keep an open mind, we have a habit of moving things into the direction that we see it, and how that really, even in the best of settings, you can totally miss the target. And to be open to that and not even necessarily see that as a failure, certainly see it as something to inform you to be that much more open and receptive of local input. So there was really so many different things that really informing for me, so many different exchanges that occurred.
People were at the heart of AGAG's work, and the network was a space where people were influenced by each other. There was a core group that consistently participated in the network, but there was also a constant flow of new people with new perspectives. Conversations were repeated, and how some issues were discussed did change over its 2 decades of work. But the issues of power, representation, and narratives remained perennial topics. Vuyiswa Sidzumo reflects on AGAG's impact.
Vuyiswa Sidzumo. I've been a member of the steering committee of AGAG when I worked for the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation as a program officer, and later the chair of the AGAG steering committee. I am now working for the Ford Foundation as the regional director for the Office for Southern Africa. AGAG, even without naming things, has been surfacing some things over time. And some people have now picked on those things and they've become fashionable. The issues of power, and there's the whole movement now around shifting power. And I think it's something that AGAG has handled very subtly without explicitly naming it that. So on that front, and because we didn't need to prove anything to anyone, the shifting of power really happened. Of course, we can't say it's all hunky-dory, now we can sing kumbaya and walk away. No, but I think you saw dramatic shifts because even in how then people were given the space that would not ordinarily have been given the space in before. So that's the one thing. And also, if you're looking at the issue of narrative, AGAG talked about narratives for the longest time, right? And it's not even a question of, you've said that before. Some things have to be repeated because I do know that there are colleagues, but we were talking about this 5 years ago. For me, it's actually a success that it's still topical if it still hasn't been addressed. So there were those topics, because things had not shifted, that kept coming up. And for various reasons. Some reasons could be that it was different people from these foundations that had never discussed those. And for them, the issues were still topical. And also that, indeed, the field had not faced head on those issues. So, which meant then they still needed to be on the table, because until they are successfully resolved. So to an extent, I would say some topics have persisted over time, rightfully so, but there are some things that have also changed over time. So I do want to believe that there has been some shift in how people make grants to people on the, to organizations on the continent, just purely from understanding them better and understanding these as human beings and not just a grant check and a side visit once every 3 years. So I don't say this out of any scientific research, but just also hearing conversations in the room.
There is no doubt that AGAG made an impact on those who were a part of the network and found it to be a place to learn, share, and grow. You heard from people who participated in the discussions and were part of its evolution. They discussed the tensions and power dynamics that are so often inherent in their work and reflected on the many conversations about narratives, relationships, and power, but most importantly, how to change the practices and process for working together. Niamani offers these insights for practitioners, grant-making organizations, and the philanthropy community.
After working with AGAG for over 20 years and seeing new people and new funders enter and exit the sector, moderating the discussions, and deepening my own knowledge and understanding, I would offer these brief insights. So first, as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I would encourage foundations and funding organizations to view as essential opportunities for program staff to connect with colleagues and people who can help them better understand the culture of the organizations and the communities they are funding. And in developing the strategies, I would also encourage foundations and funding organizations to remember the saying, nothing about us without us. Now, secondly, I've developed a lot of empathy for practitioners, the program staff. We worked with Stephen Lawrence on a research project to understand how practitioners navigate their roles and relationships. And they share how difficult it is to influence strategy and funding decisions, even though they are seen as the primary arbiters of those decisions. So for them, I'd say understanding how your foundation's priorities and those of the organizations you are funded fit within the broader landscape. And that can help you to understand how changes in both affect the impact of your support. Finally, managing a funder network, it's not easy, especially in light of the constant turnover in the program staff and the shifting priorities of funders. And it really depends on how you view your role. I saw mine as creating a welcoming and a diverse space where people would engage in candid conversation, especially about the sensitive issues that it was difficult for them to talk about within their grant-making organization. And I think the ground rules of equity and respect and intellectual honesty were important in stewarding a space where people felt safe in disagreeing with each other and voicing their opinions. And I do think it's important to understand how narratives shape grant-making practices and to challenge people to not only change the narratives, but change the practices.
This podcast is part of the AGAG Legacy Project to document its history and contributions to the philanthropy sector. Niamani reflects on the Legacy Project's significance.
So AGAG is a network of practitioners, and it's always been about people. We've always operated on the belief that people shape policies and practices. So if you can influence the people in charge of them, you can change them. But it's very difficult to change how the philanthropy industry operates. And that's why the issues we discussed over the years are perennial ones. We understand how navigating roles and relationships is challenging for practitioners and how power dynamics are inherent in the grant-making process. And we did talk about the transactional aspect of cross-border giving, and people were able to connect with colleagues with common interest. But what people found, what stands out to them, as reflected in the comments you hear in this and other podcasts about AGAG, is how the conversations and being a part of the community encourage them to reflect and think, and as Mamo Mohapi said, to go deep. How AGAG influenced them personally and by extension, professionally. Now, as we evolved, we got better at it and we expanded our reach and we became more diverse and we had more voices in the room and more divergent opinions and more spirited discussions. But how people experience their involvement with AGAG, how AGAG changed them, that's AGAG's legacy. That's why the AGAG Legacy Project is relevant and significant. Because finding a way to capture people's experiences is difficult, but you get a flavor of it and how, in perhaps subtle but perceptible ways, they did see that change did happen.
Thank you for listening to this program about the work of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. A special thanks to those you heard from in this segment for their insights and candor. Please see the program notes for credits, bios, and links to more information. This episode was produced by Talia Grimes of T-Muse Media and Niamani Mutima. AGAG is fiscally sponsored by Tide Center, a non-profit organization.